Thank you for joining us on A Slice of Medieval. Today we have a very special guest, one of my favourite authors, Angus Donald, who's the best-selling author of The Outlaw Chronicles, a series of 10 novels featuring a gangsterish Robin Hood. Angus has also written the absolutely fabulous Holcroft Blood trilogy, about a mildly autistic 17th century English artillery officer, son of the notorious Crown Jewels thief Colonel Thomas Blood, and 3 of the best books I've ever read. And I think I did put that in the review, Angus. His latest series, the Fireborn series, is set in 8th century Central Europe, following the exploits of Bjarki. Is that how I pronounce it?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I've always said Bjarki, but I don't speak Old Norse, and nor even any modern sort of Danish or Swedish. So I've always said Bjarki, but I have no idea. I had someone who corrected me on another pronunciation. An English guy who lives in Sweden. He said, "You don't pronounce it like this; it's pronounced like that." So I'm now very wary of saying how things should be pronounced, because I don't speak any of those languages, sadly. Yeah, let's call him Bjarki. Bjarki Bloodhand.
Right. You see, I had this issue with Matthew Harvey as well, because of the way he pronounces his characters. And it's like, when you're talking about 7th century and 8th century, it's like, we haven't a clue. Nobody's got it recorded, have they? It's not on tape.
No.
If you don't know, Angus, we don't care. Really.
Okay, great.
So, welcome, Angus. So, your series is set in Saxon Germany in the 8th century. What inspired you to write about that era and place?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. I forgot to say that. It's great to be on the show. Why 8th century Germany? I came to it by a slightly weird set of reasons, because I discovered the Great Wall of Denmark when I was thinking about doing a Viking thing. I was thinking about doing a sort of Norse Viking-y thing. And I came across the Great Wall of Denmark, which is a earthwork sort of about 20 foot high with a big wooden fence on top that went straight across, right the way across the bottom of the Jutland Peninsula. It's basically a huge 20-mile, actually it's 10-mile long wall, because there are bits of river and bog and stuff, but it's a barrier that cuts off Denmark from Germany. And I was fascinated by this because I'd never heard of it. And this is about 3 or 4 years ago. And I started looking at it, and I came up with the sort of idea that basically these earthworks are very interesting because they not only kind of are defensive mechanisms, they're walls, they're fortifications, but they also demarcate nationality. And you get the same thing with, for example, Hadrian's Wall. If there hadn't been a Hadrian's Wall, the line between Scotland and England would have been a lot more vague. The borders were always still a bit sort of wishy-washy. So it might have extended this way or that way. But by having a big wall across it, you create Scotland and you also create England. A similar thing happened with Offa's Dyke between England and Wales. Yeah. And so to find one in Scandinavia, or sort of North Germany, was fascinating. So I started reading about it, and I realized that it was used to keep the Saxons out of Denmark, and then actually the Franks, who were Christians, who under Charlemagne conquered Saxony. And I started reading about this 30-year war, which took place at the end of the 8th century and the first few years of the 9th century, when the French Christians, basically Franks, conquered by force Saxony and killed everybody who didn't. They basically baptized people at the point of a sword. Do you accept the faith of Jesus Christ, or shall I kill you? That sort of thing. And I thought this was fascinating. And it slotted in with the time when I was thinking about writing about Vikings. So I thought these Saxons were pagans. They worshipped Woden and Thunor and basically Odin, Thor, and all the other Norse gods. They were pretty much, they spoke of it pretty much the same as the Danes, who were their great allies. So the Saxons and the Danes were great allies. And during these wars, the Danes fought with the Saxons against the Franks. So you've got Danes at the almost just before the Viking Age, fighting with Saxons against Christians. And it seemed to me that this is quite an interesting way to write Viking novels, because it's just before, it's actually technically the Vendel period, but it's just before the official start, if you like, and the official start of the Viking Age, which is the attack on Lindisfarne in
794.
794. Yeah, I haven't got to that bit because that's out of my time period. So something like 790 something, and that's when people say, well, this is when Vikings officially start, and this is 20 years earlier. But of course, they were the same people.
Yeah.
They're using the same technology, the same boats, the same battle weapons, same gods, same culture, same society. So why are they suddenly Vikings after this point and not before? And I thought, okay, let's just call them Vikings, or let's just think of them as Vikings. And the Saxons also believed in the same gods, fought in shield walls with axes and and swords and round shields and stuff. So I thought this is an interesting way to approach a Viking novel. I like to write books that are sort of, I don't know what, I think it's something to do with some flaw in my character, but I never approach things straight on. I always do something and then just go slightly off. So, for example, my Robin Hood isn't a good guy. He's a gangster. I've got this English artilleryman and I made him autistic because it just makes it slightly more interesting to have a kind of like, not to just do, no disrespect to all the other people who are writing about Vikings, but they tend to be rather samey. And it's like, here's a young boy and he joins a Viking band and then there's some revenge and that sort of stuff. Whereas if you make it slightly different, where there's actually a war going on and he's brought in to fight against a huge army of Christians who are much more powerful than his small group of people, then it's much more interesting. So it was basically my usual trick of taking a subject and then slightly kind of going into a different angle than everybody else to try and make it stand out, try and make my work stuff stand out. Also because it interests me. Sorry, that was a very long answer to a very simple question.
No, a very good answer though.
And it's nice. I mean, I did actually find it quite refreshing that it was in Germany, because I'm there thinking, oh, it's Vikings, but different, because we are very Anglo-centric in our study of Vikings.
That's the word I was groping for, Anglo-centric. I was trying to think about. Yeah, we do, and actually, I keep buying books. I bought one called The Wolf Age, and it's supposed to be talking about Viking stuff, but it's basically all about Vikings in England. And also, when you try and get books about Saxons, it's always about Saxons in England. And actually, there's so much more interesting stuff going on in Saxony during this period and in Scandinavia, but I guess we just don't get it. Or perhaps they're not translated into English. They're in Danish or in Swedish or in German, and I can't read any of those languages. But Anglo-centric is quite right, yeah.
That was my next question. How hard is it, given that you're writing about Germany in the 8th century, how hard is it to research the period? Was there a lot of sources in English?
No, there's one source which is in Latin, there's a little bit more, but there's one main source which is called the Royal Frankish Annals, and it's written from Charlemagne's point of view, and it's really spare, like all of these things, and it's totally pro-Christian and pro-Charlemagne because it's written by his own monks who relied upon him for their, stipends. And it describes the Saxons as awful pagans and, dreadful people and, the worst kind of evilness because they were non-Christian. So you have to kind of take that with a pinch of salt. And the fact the second book in the series, The Saxon Wolf, I wrote the entire book, which is basically the campaign in Saxony, or 2 years worth of campaign, based on about 3 paragraphs from the Royal Frankish Annals in Latin, which someone had translated into English. I read the English translation, but it's very spare. It's like the king went here and fought a battle and slew the Saxons, and then he went here, Charlemagne went here and fought a battle and routed the Saxons, and then he went over here and killed these Saxons. And it's like, it's 3 paragraphs of stuff, and I use that to reconstruct an entire novel out of that. So to answer your question, again, I'm being very difficult here, not answering your questions, but to answer your question is the sources are very scant. There are very few of them, but you can extrapolate from what you have got to have a sort of idea of when things happened and in what order and who was there. And you have the names of the Saxon warlords, and then you kind of create a character for them. And then you've got, that so-and-so went there, and then they sacked this monastery and burnt it, and you can do a scene about that. So scant stuff. But I also use, I don't know whether this is preempting another question, but the theme is berserkerness in all of these books, which I've taken to mean being possessed by an animal spirit, usually a bear or a wolf. And I've written a whole sort of mythology into the novels about this. And that, the idea of how do you know what it's like to be possessed by a bear and turn ferocious, I got from my time as an anthropologist in Indonesia in the 1980s. When I was studying spirit possession, I'd go to ceremonies where people regularly were possessed by the spirits of either gods or demons or evil monsters, and they would become possessed, and they were completely convinced that they were Arjuna, the warrior prince, or that they were an evil witch, and they would behave inside the temple. It usually took place inside temples with a lot of gamelan music, a lot of evocative music. So having spent time studying spirit possession, I felt I had a fairly good idea of what it might have been like to believe in this so strongly that you believe that the spirit of a bear was coming inside you as a berserker and then turning you into this ferocious bear warrior. So there's not very much in the historical sense, but I used a lot of my own experience of this psychological state to inform the novels and Bjarki Blood and the Berserker. So not a lot of historical stuff, but a lot of stuff with maps and a lot of reading about how Vikings or Saxons, and I'm using the two terms interchangeably. Saxons, I think Saxons were the same as Vikings. A bit more horses, that's all really. Same gods and that kind of thing. So use all that good stuff we have about Vikings and then sort of put it onto the Saxons.
Yeah, I mean, in your historical notes at the end of The Last Berserker, you refer to historical fiction as a blend of history and invention, and what you've just described is exactly that, isn't it? Where you have the bare bones of some history, but of course you can't write a novel with just the bare bones. So the invention comes in there, and you bring, as you have, a lot of yourself into it as well, of other experiences. So I think for me it worked extremely well.
Oh, thank you.
I quite like the school for berserkers idea, the kind of Hogwarts for berserkers, which I thought was amazing. I thought it was a very, very, very good invention, and exactly an example of what you mean by inventing something which makes the novel a bit different. When you spoke earlier about how do you make another novel about Vikings, like sort of Vikings, Jim, but not as we know it. It's sort of a little bit different, and I think you've certainly succeeded there. I think it's an excellent blend of history and invention.
Well, thank you. I mean, the other thing with that school, I hate the term Hogwarts for Vikings, but that's what people have been calling it. Some guy wrote a scathing review saying, "I can't believe it's so ridiculous. Hogwarts for Vikings, what a ridiculous idea." So I don't like that, but let's call it a school. I mean, the idea of a cult center where they believe, bear cults were very strong, and so were wolf cults, and to have them in this place, because the world tree of both Saxon and Viking culture, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but they believe that the world was shaped like a tree, and at the top you've got a kind of heaven, and at the bottom you've got a freezing hell, and the middle realm is in the middle of the tree. And so they sort of saw the world and our place in it, humans' place in it, as a tree. And they're supposed to have found the site of the original tree, which was a massive oak tree in Saxony, in the very place that I have. So there was supposed to have been a big tree there, and Charlemagne cut it down. So in the second book, he goes there and he cuts down the tree. And actually what happened is that straight afterwards, they built a church on top of it in order to kind of nullify the pagan evilness. Yeah. And there's still a church on it, and I've forgotten what it's called, but I think St. Peter and St. Paul actually and there's a church there. It was a wooden one to start with, and then they turned it into a stone church, and it's still on the site. So we think this is where the world tree was in North Germany, which was venerated by both the Saxons and the Vikings. And I thought it'd be fantastic to set this Hogwarts, if you like, this bear cult place on the site. It's also a very easily defensible, what should be easy. They don't defend it very well, but it's a sort of outcropping from the plain, from a valley, and it's flat topped, and it's this sort of place that's natural for a fortress or a defensible position with a tree growing out the top of it. So it's just such a weird geographical feature. It's almost kind of fantasy like, actually.
Yeah, but when you come across something like that, you just have to use it.
Yeah,
don't you? I mean,
yeah.
It's too tempting to avoid, really.
Yes, quite. I love a good tree.
So when you're putting together the history and the invention, in the case of, say, the first one, The Last Berserker, where did you struggle? What were the difficulties of doing that, did you find?
The most difficult thing is that Berserkers didn't live very long. Basically, they go doolally and charge, not very well armed. Well, they've got a bear skin on, and charge into the middle of the enemy shield wall, and sometimes break through. But they would have taken such horrific injuries because humans don't react well to spears and axes and stuff. And no matter how crazy you are, there's still some guy who can shoot you with an arrow. So the most difficult thing is making it believable and exciting, but he's got to get injured. And and in fact, it's beginning to get a bit boring, because at the end of every book, he almost dies. He almost dies from his wounds, but somehow doesn't just die, and he manages to carry on. And in the next book, he's got another battle to fight. So kind of getting that, getting that thing happening is I'm now. I've finished book 4. I'm about to start writing book 5. I've got to think of a way for him not to get injured every time, because no human being could actually. I've got him covered in scars.
Yeah,
but,
I know.
It's still, I mean, and the truth about medieval warriors, which I'm sure you both know, is that they probably would only fight 1 or 2 battles in their entire lives. So, if you were a knight or I think you do post-Roman, don't you, Derek?
Oh, yeah, I did. I've done a post-Roman series.
I mean, you still would only have 1 big battle in your life, probably, or 2. But as historical novelists, we kind of need more than 1. Otherwise, it would be a very short series.
I know. Yeah, difficult.
I've forgotten what the question was. What was the most difficult thing? Yeah, it was basically making it believable, him getting all these injuries and then surviving. So there's a quasi magical element. I mean, it is still historical fiction, but he believes very strongly that he has this bear spirit inside him, and when he gets better, he attributes it to the sort of bear helping him. And when he gets extra strength to carry on fighting, he thinks it's the bear giving him the strength and that sort of thing. So it's that quasi-psychological stroke magical stuff. I mean, I try not to have anything that isn't physically possible. I mean, he can't fly or anything, but he does have an awful lot of manic energy, put it that way.
I love the way he actually feels about it as well. When he comes out of it, he's not proud of himself for having done it. He knows he's lost control.
Well, I have this it doesn't happen very often now, but when I was younger, I sometimes got into physical fights with people, and I had a rather sort of wild early adulthood. But after I'd fought somebody, I'd always burst into tears, which is incredibly bad, particularly if you've won. The other guy's on the ground, you're still standing. And you're weeping, and your tears are running down your face, and everyone's going, "What's the matter with him? He won!" But I used to get this incredible sort of burst of adrenaline, and the aftermath of that was tears and self-disgust and all of that kind of stuff. So I was trying to incorporate that in. I mean, I've never been obviously I have been in a battle, but I didn't fight in it. I was just watching it in Afghanistan when I was a war correspondent. But when you're in physical combat, I found that there was a huge emotional release at the end of it when you've won and it's over, and I used to burst into tears. So I try and do that with Bjarki, because I imagine it's 100 times more powerful for him than for me in my little after the pub fist fights.
So we've covered a lot about the Berserker bit, but what I found was with the Berserker school, Bjarki does discover his inner wrecker, but Tor doesn't.
Yeah.
And even though she's the one who is desperate to become a Berserker, she never finds it, and Bjarki is the one who wasn't really sure he wanted to.
Yeah. I've treated Tor very badly, I think. I mean, she doesn't get to be a berserker, and she never will, because you can't have two berserkers. It's ridiculous. So, there's got to be one of them who's a berserker, and she's already a very accomplished warrior, but she desperately wants this, and she can't get there, and she never will. And the other thing she wants is a man. And she's never going to get one of those either. So I have treated well. I should never say never, because I feel an obligation to give her some joy, and she has a sort of surrogate child. I don't know how far along in the series you've got, but she gets a kind of surrogate daughter.
Spoiler alert.
Oh, okay, right, yeah. So there's some, there's some satisfaction for her, but I feel really sorry for her. But I also love her very much, because she's such an interesting character. She's so spiky and rude and awkward and uncomfortable in herself. She's a bit like me sometimes, I mean, all characters take a little bit of yourself, of course. But she kind of like can't take a compliment. She can't allow herself to be happy. She can't be cool or calm. She's always kind of jostling and awkward and spiky and rude, and then bristling with anger, and then sort of resentful. And she's just like a really uncomfortable woman, uncomfortable in her own skin. But it makes her, I think, an interesting character to spend time with. Definitely. As long as you wouldn't have. I don't know if she'd be much fun to actually be with, but
I wrote the word spiky down. Actually, I was going to ask you about her, because I'm a great fan of spiky female characters. Yeah. And I found it interesting that in the relationship between Bjarki and Tor, he's the sort of gentle giant and she's the grumpy one.
Yes.
Sometimes it's the other way around. But you have been a bit unkind to her. But having been down that road myself, I think that's not a problem. I think it creates a very interesting character.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of need to find some happiness for her at some point, just because it's just unfair. But I don't think she can be a berserker. For the dynamics of the novel, it works if one is and one isn't. And she's a very accomplished warrior, and and kind of much cleverer than Bjarki. Bjarki's not all that bright. He's a bit stupid. He's kind of like well-intentioned and bumbling, and but she's really sharp. She knows immediately what's going on. So she's got other great qualities, but she can never really be a berserker, because perhaps being a berserker requires submission. A bit like the sort of Islamic sense that in order to know God, you have to submit yourself to God. That was one of the things I was thinking about when I was writing the characters. Submission is something that I can't imagine Tor ever doing. But but Bjarki's kind of much more happy, confident with that sort of allowing things to happen to him, whereas Tor not at all.
No, that's true. So do you identify with Bjarki?
A bit, but also with Tor, and with Valtyr as well. I suppose because Bjarki's a man, and everybody, I was always considered rather stupid as a child and a young man, and by my family, particularly, and my people at school and stuff. Everyone thought I was completely thick, and I knew I wasn't, but it was trying to persuade people otherwise. It's too much like hard work, so I just kind of let it go. And perhaps I am very thick. I don't know. But I mean, I that's one of the things that I'm very resentful about, is that everybody wrote me off as a moron, and I'm not. It's very difficult to say I'm not a moron.
So you were misunderstood as a child.
Absolutely, yes. All the best writers are, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
No, but your books can speak for you, because the amount of research in them and the storytelling skills, it's like, no, you're not.
You've got to have something that drives you, haven't you? You've got to have a...
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. It's different for different people, but as you say, that if you're a writer, I think it has to come from inside, and certain things are driving certain people.
To answer your question, yes, I do identify a bit as Bjarki, because I've got a temper as well. And there was one time when I kind of first got the idea. I was living as a beach bum in Crete. When I was 18, I lived on the beach in Crete for a year. I had a fantastic time. I didn't have any money. I sort of robbed greenhouses for a few tomatoes for supper, and I did bits of work as well. I did a lot of labouring work, lifting cement bags and building stuff, and like 1 or 2 days a week. And the rest of the time I was just hanging out on the beach and having a terrific time. And I shared a flat with a good friend of mine, and we were kind of play wrestling. Just, we were 18-year-old fit guys, and we were just kind of messing around. And I pinned him down, and he bit me, and I completely lost it and grabbed his head and started smashing it against the stone floor and knocked him unconscious. And I recognized in that, I mean, I could have killed him, but obviously I didn't. He had a big bruise on his head, but and he bit me, and he deserved it. but I suddenly had an inkling of what it must be like to be a berserker when suddenly you snap and you could. I mean, that is a tiny example of me play wrestling with a friend and losing it and banging his head on the ground. But in that little instant, I recognized that spark in me, perhaps in every other human being, of red rage, just incandescent rage. And I thought, and I kept that, it's a memory for 35 years or something, and thought one day I'm going to use that. And that's probably the origin of the Berserker books. That one moment when I suddenly realized that I was capable of killing this guy, and actually I wanted to kill him for about a second and a half. And then I get to my senses, and sometimes I've had it a couple of times, just sort of absolute rage, and then it goes. But if that was sustained over an hour, you could do a lot of damage to a shield wall, I think.
Especially if somebody put an axe in your hand.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, sharp object.
Well, yes. Keep the axe away from me.
So, you've said you sort of identify with several characters. Do you have a favourite character in the series?
I quite like Holcroft Blood. Oh, sorry, in this series.
No, in this series, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Tor, actually, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, Bjarke's kind of a bit one note. I mean, he's kind of, he's kind and he's big and he's dull and he's a nice guy, and then he goes absolutely ape shit. But that's all he does. Whereas Tor, with her tortured kind of inability to be happy, an inability to be herself, or to find any kind of peace, I find her interesting as well. So I really like her. Unfortunately, I just keep making things more difficult for her every book. No, I do. I love her very much. I really do. But it's just, if I then have her kind of finding a nice guy and settling down, having some babies, having a lovely time, there's no story, No.
She doesn't think you like her, I'll tell you that.
And she does get one at the end of, I can't remember which book it is, but she gets one eventually, and it's boring, and then she doesn't want to do it anymore.
And she doesn't want that either, because, I mean, I just read, when Bjarke was talking about getting a piece of land, a farm, and she's like, that's her worst nightmare.
She's saying, I don't want to spend my entire life in the back of beyond, getting stones out of the ground and raising a meager crop of barley. What's the point of that? So she kind of it's her own worst enemy. But I think she's my favorite character. She's the one I'm most proud of creating.
I have a soft spot for Garm, the bear.
Yes. Oh yeah, he's very sweet.
He's gorgeous. I love it. I want an enclosure in the back garden and a bear.
Well, yeah, he's kind of a little bit dangerous. I mean, the way that he is with Bjarke and Tor is great, because they can cuddle him and sort of snuggle up to him and stuff, and that's what you want from a big bear. I think he eats a stable boy in one of the things.
Yeah, I've just read that scene where Bjarke goes to Lord Brun and apologises for the fact that Garm ate his servant.
I'm terribly sorry. I thought I was laughing when I wrote.
Yeah, that's right.
And the guy's completely cool about it. Lord, whatever, is completely cool about it.
Yeah,
because he's only a thrall.
But don't let him do it again.
Yes, don't do it again. Let this be a warning. But no, yeah, Garm is great.
I love the fact that there is that kind of humour in the book as well.
Well, I do. I sometimes write jokes into books. I do it, and then I realise I probably shouldn't do that because it undermines the seriousness of it. But I do quite like it when you've got a joke once in a while.
We're not all serious all the time, are we? So even in war, you're going to have banter.
Yes, that's true. Yes. Yeah, even when lots of people are, I mean, particularly, I think if you look at sort of the trenches of the First World War or the Second World War, the soldiers were endlessly making kind of black gallows humor jokes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that sort of black humor in warfare. I remember once in one of my first books, Alan Dale and his eventual wife Goody are being attacked by wolves, and I think it's Alan says, "Remember, they're more frightened of us than we are of them." And they both just start laughing because it's completely untrue.
Yeah.
No, they're not.
They don't look it.
Yeah. No, I think my favourite character is Tor as well, because as I said, I've got a thing for spiky women characters.
Yeah, you've got a thing for spiky women characters who have every challenge in the book thrown at them. So yeah, I can see you read.
Well, yeah, but I wonder. It did occur to me while we were talking whether you and I, Angus, have something in common, that we are both men, and as far as I'm aware,
I'm sure you are.
maybe I don't know, do women write those sort of characters for women?
To be honest, I think it's very difficult to write women well as a man. I struggled. In fact, a lot of in the first sort of books I was writing, the Robin Hood books, I had hardly any women. I didn't really know how to do them, and I had token girlfriends and wives. They kind of like didn't really do anything. They sort of said, they were just beautiful and stood there and didn't really have much agency. And I kind of knew that it wasn't good, but I couldn't work out how to do it. And I began to get a bit better, but it's a difficult thing to learn. I think Tor is the best woman I've created, though I did have quite a good bad woman in the end of the Robin Hood books who was seducing people and then betraying them, and she was fun because she was just like completely and I realized that she behaved exactly like a man.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was sort of angling at in a way. Is, I mean, what I did with my spiky woman Eleanor was I gave her a sister who was sort of the opposite. So there was a kind of there was a norm, as it were. This is a normal woman of that period, and this isn't. But it is difficult.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea. Yeah. I mean, the problem with writing, I'm Sharon, I'm sure you'll recognize this as well, about medieval women, is that there's not very much. I mean, Nicola de la Haye is a good example, because she's like an independent, strong woman, Castellan of the castle, and but there aren't a lot of women. Don't appear very much in the stories, except as wives or pawns or mothers or queens, like Ellen of Aquitaine, perhaps. But they're not very many, because most of the times they were drudges and they had a pretty miserable time. I mean, this is a time when you could basically kidnap someone and say, right, we're married now. And there wasn't really a lot, you had to depend on your male relatives to come and rescue you. And even they would be reluctant, because once you've been kidnapped and presumably raped, nobody wants you back. So it's not a great time for women.
No.
I mean, being a medieval woman must be a poor medieval woman. But even the rich ones, we focus on Eleanor of Aquitaine and Nicola de la Haye. That's like, less than 1%. And even the aristocratic women would have been traded like cattle pretty much in order to make alliances and to cement relationships.
The best hope for any woman in those days was for her husband to die first.
Yeah.
Because once you were a widow...
Yes, because as a widow...
You had so much power.
Yeah.
You had to pay the king to stay widowed before he married you off to someone else.
Yes, that's true, yeah.
But once you were a widow, you had your lands and you had your money. You could do what you wanted.
Yeah.
And I suspect there were a lot more widows than you might think, except for the danger of childbirth. Men were getting killed in battles and diseases and caught up in political machinations and beheaded. And so they were probably, and also they tended to marry slightly younger women, or sometimes considerably younger women, and then they would have died off, earlier as a result. So there probably were a lot more widows around than we think at that time.
There's one, I think, Isabella of Gloucester, who was the first wife of King John.
Yeah.
After Geoffrey de Mandeville, her second husband, died, she signs a charter in my free widowhood.
Ah, interesting. Okay, yeah.
Unfortunately, she's then forced to marry Hubert de Burgh.
Oh, right, yeah.
But for a moment, she's happy.
In my free widowhood. That's a lovely expression. Yeah. Actually, I should have some. I think I might need to get a widow in my next one.
One who's very happy to stay a widow.
Very happily widowed.
Yeah, widows are good. Widows give you a different sort of female character.
Yeah. Actually, that's a good point.
Right, so last question. If there was a TV series made of the Fireborn book, who do you imagine playing Bjarki?
Well, I'm not very good at actors, because the ones that I remember are sort of a bit past their sell-by. So Sean Bean, Sean Bean I thought was terrific and sharp. I think he'd make a fantastic Bjarki, but he's too old. He's now 60.
Sean Bean 20 years ago.
Yeah, Sean Bean, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
I did see The Northman recently, and that's got Alexander Skarsgård, who's who's like seriously kind of like buff and
Mm.
good looking. So I think he'd be rather good, Bjarki. Though it needs to be someone not quite as handsome. I don't think Bjarki's terribly handsome. I think he's kind of like a big slab of blonde muscle, and he's kind of a sort of Terminator type, Arnold Schwarzenegger, but with blonde hair. The answer is I don't know, because I don't know who the current crop of 20-something actors are, and often they haven't made their name. And in fact, the ones who are famous tend to be the sort of pretty ones, like Timothy Chalamet, or so that they haven't really got beefcake guys, which is what Bjarki would be. He'd be like very intimidating and huge, and a sort of Russell Crowe but 2 foot taller, and again 30 years younger. I don't know. I mean, I try not to think about TV because it gets me so upset that nobody's doing it. But well, there's so much bad TV being made. It's such a lot of terrible. I mean, I every night I look at Netflix and Amazon Prime, and I struggle to find something that's watching, and then I do watch it, and I know it's a mediocre thing. And even, I mean, I've been watching a Viking-ish thing recently, and it's not very good. It's like kind of the dialogue's wooden, the whole thing looks ridiculous, it's stagey and bad. And even The Northman, which I saw recently, I thought was unremittingly bleak. I don't know if either of you have seen that, but it's the story of Amleth, which is where we get the Hamlet story. A guy whose uncle kills his father, marries his mother, and it's the sort of Hamlet origin story. But it's unremittingly bleak, and it's a vision of Vikings in the north as a place of endless, brutal, hideous terror. And I don't think that any society can actually be like that. I thought it got the headlines for its brutality and its nastiness, but actually all human beings have moments, as we were talking before about jokes and laughter and all that kind of thing. All human beings have to have some light and relief, so they have love and games and jokes and riddles and fun stuff, as well as fighting and revenge and all of those things. And if you have this guy who just goes on this journey of hideous suffering all the way through, either he's suffering or he's making other people suffer, it doesn't seem very authentic at all, and then dies in the end.
Spoiler alert.
Long-winded answer to your question. I don't really know who would play it, who would play Bjarki. I have no idea who played Tor. It would be quite difficult, I think, to cast them. And someone else would do it. It wouldn't be me. It'd be whoever was making. And I probably wouldn't like their choice, and I probably wouldn't like what they've done with the script. Hopefully, I would like the money. I'm not a filmmaker. I'm not a TV guy. I write novels and try and keep putting them out, and then maybe somebody will make a movie of them or TV of them, or maybe they won't.
It's like Bernard Cornwell says, isn't it? When the Sharp books were turned into a series, and then Uhtred is like, you have to let it go.
Yeah.
You have to say, the books were mine, but the TV isn't, because they do it so differently. You can't just sit there and go, I wouldn't have done that. No, I don't like that. You've just got to let it go and let them get on with it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right attitude. I listened to the reunion on Radio 4 the other day, which was about the making of the Sharp series and how incredibly difficult it was. And they shot in Crimea, and they had things went wrong, and they ran out of water, and they were all dying of thirst, and they were menaced by the Russian mafia, and it was a litany of disasters. And so I went back last night and I watched the first episode of Sharp, and it's still not very good. I mean, I enjoyed them at the time, but it's shoddy. The acting's terrible. Actually, the dialogue is quite good. The writing's quite good, but you've got 20 people marching along, and they say, the 5th division is 20 guys. And you're thinking, hang on a second, that's not even a platoon. They're calling it a division of 5,000 people. Yeah. And of course, extras are expensive, but it just looks cheap and crappy, and you can get away with it on board ship because you've got very tight angles. But when you're filming a big battle, I mean, now you can do it, I guess, with CGI. But when you need to see thousands of people all crashing up against each other, and when they swipe at each other with their swords, it's so clear that they're not actually hitting them. It's like a sort of stage punch.
Yeah. I must say, I watched the Last Kingdom film, Seven Kings Must Die, at the weekend, and I thought the battle they did at the end, the Battle of Brunanburh, I thought that was really well done, and they did get enough people into it.
I thought it was good, quite good, except they had every cliche in the book. Caltrops.
Oh yeah, I wondered if that caltrops was just a nod to Sharp, because that's where I learnt about caltrops.
Me too. That's where I got caltrops
I'd
from.
never heard of them until then.
And then they got the logs being tugged between two horsemen, which is straight out of Spartacus.
Yeah.
Then they had the feigned retreat. I don't know why they did that. They retreated to get them on the caltrops.
That was a little too obvious for me, but
It was kind of like it was a bit kind of, I don't know. I mean, I enjoyed it, So
it was the numbers as well, though. You could actually see it as a battle because they did have decent number of people on each side.
If it had been Sharp, there'd be 3 people.
Yeah. And they'd be joining the end of the queue and going round again.
The thing is, with early medieval battle, you are looking at 300 or 400 people on either side most of the time. It's just when you get to the Napoleonic and you've got armies of 100,000 on either side.
Yes, I'm writing Mongol stuff at the moment, and I've suddenly realised that there's no way they could ever film this.
The horde. Well, it's been absolutely fabulous talking to you, Angus. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a great pleasure. I've enjoyed myself enormously. We haven't laughed so much for ages. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you, for a very entertaining morning.
And if you haven't read any of Angus's books, or have only read the Outlaw books or the Holcroft Blood books, give Fireborn and Bjarki a go, because they are absolutely fabulous.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Sharon. Thank you, Derek.
And hopefully I'll catch up with you at some point.
Yes. Well, next time we're having some sort of jamboree for one of our historical societies, hopefully.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks very much indeed. And see you both soon, I hope.
Okay, then.
Yep, definitely. Thanks, Angus.
Right, so our next podcast will feature our very own Sharon Bennett Connolly, and I shall be asking her about her brand new book on Nicola de la Haye.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of A Slice of Medieval. I'm Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.